Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving headfirst into an absolutely fascinating historical detective story. We're looking at how modern dirt, literally, archaeological stratigraphy, challenges the legendary texts about King Solomon's massive empire. We're going to unearth the reality of the united monarchy by looking closely at the text, the tell, and the timeline. To make sense of centuries of history, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the Golden Age expectation, then the stratigraphic disconnect, shifting the timeline, the true regional superpower, and finally, the architecture of memory. Let's jump right in. All right, part 1, the Golden Age expectation, or our textual baseline. We have to start with the established cultural narrative we all know, right? According to the ancient texts, between roughly 1050 and 930 BCE, figures like Saul, David, and Solomon ruled over an absolute powerhouse of a state. We are talking about a massive centralized empire stretching all across the Levant. Think monumental wealth, huge international trade networks with places like Sheba, and a sprawling, heavily fortified capital in Jerusalem. For a long time, this was the baseline expectation early archaeologists carried with them right into the field. But that brings us to part 2, the stratigraphic disconnect. Or, simply put, where's the evidence? Here is where our mystery really begins. When you starkly juxtapose that textual expectation of a 10th century Levantine superpower against the actual physical dirt, the cognitive dissonance is incredibly jarring. Archaeologists digging into 10th century Jerusalem run into this massive problem known as the empty Iron Age. Basically, there's just scant monumental architecture in Judah during this specific window of time. Even crazier, there is zero contemporary international record of them. No Egyptians, no Syrians, no Hittites mention anything about a united Israelite empire. To put that into perspective, archaeological surveys reveal that 10th century Jerusalem was definitely not a sprawling capital. It was actually a really modest 10 to 20 hectare settlement. That's essentially a small, rural highland chiefdom. It's completely inconsistent with the massive administrative needs of an empire. So, let's look at part 3, shifting the timeline, and the massive paradigm shift that changed everything. We're left with a giant question. If Solomon didn't build all that grand, monumental architecture early excavators found, who did? Well, enter the paradigm shift known as the low chronology, championed by researchers like Israel Finkelstein. He argued that earlier excavators essentially had biblical goggles on. They found big walls, assumed it had to be Solomon's time, and just dated the dirt accordingly, instead of relying on independent pottery data. Under the old way of thinking, monumental architecture was pegged right to the 10th century, matching up perfectly with David and Solomon. But by correcting the building layers based on that independent pottery data, researchers lowered the dates by 50 to 100 years. By doing that, the grand architecture is pulled out of the 10th century entirely and drops squarely into the 9th century. Now, I really want to emphasize that this is not just some fun speculative theory. It is backed up by hard science. We are talking about extensive radiocarbon, C14 dating. Major excavations at Megiddo between 1992 and 2006 produced these critical datasets that independently support this timeline reassignment. The science literally proves the building phases have to move forward into the 9th century. Now, you might be wondering if there's some other way to fix this missing evidence. You'll sometimes hear about fringe theories, like the new chronology, which try to solve the problem by pushing all of ancient Egyptian history forward by 350 years. But mainstream science universally rejects that. Why? Because our ancient timeline is firmly anchored to immovable Neo-Assyrian astronomical records. You literally cannot compress the timeline without breaking hard astronomical facts. So the timeline shift of the low chronology is really the only scientifically sound conclusion we have. Which brings us to part 4, the true regional superpower, the Umayyad dynasty. With our timeline finally corrected, a brand new, massive superpower emerges from the dirt. But it's probably not the kingdom you're expecting. It's really a tale of two kingdoms side by side. 10th century Judah, down south, was basically a rural blip on the radar, entirely absent from foreign records. But up north, the 9th century northern kingdom of Israel was the true archaeological heavyweight. We're talking large fortified urban centers, massive palaces, chariot stables, and documented international alliances. This northern kingdom was ruled by the Umayyad dynasty, and their shared geopolitical power is perfectly illustrated by the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. The expanding Assyrian war machine was marching west, and to stop them, a massive coalition of 12 kings banded together. The absolutely amazing detail here is that the king of Israel was a central commander in this coalition, bringing a massive military contingent to the fight. How do we know that for sure? We have the ultimate smoking gun, the Kirk monolith. This is an Assyrian stele, and right there, carved in the stone, it explicitly names Ahab the Israelite. It records Ahab bringing a jaw-dropping force of 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers to the battle. That was one of the largest chariot forces in the entire coalition. It's incredible extra-biblical proof confirming the Omride dynasty's immense military strength. And honestly, my favorite part is that the dirt directly confirms this Assyrian text. Remember all that reassigned 9th century architecture? Well, a force of 2,000 chariots requires massive logistical infrastructure just for breeding and training all those horses. The extensive structural complexes uncovered at places like the Megiddo stables perfectly align with a military built entirely around advanced chariot warfare. It grounds this extraordinary ancient text right into the physical dirt. So, let's wrap this up with part 5, the architecture of memory, text, trauma, and tradition. We've reached a really critical pivot point in our detective story. We have the text and we have the dirt. So, how do we reconcile them? If all the hard stratigraphic evidence shows that 10th century Judah was just a modest little chiefdom, why on earth did they write an epic origin story of a grand united empire? The answer lies in what we call the historiography funnel. You see, these historical texts weren't live tweeted in real time. They were filtered over centuries. They started as raw cultural memories from around 1200 to 1000 BCE. But then, those memories passed through centuries of profound, unthinkable trauma. Specifically, the brutal Assyrian destruction of the mighty northern kingdom, and later, the total Babylonian exile of Judah. Much of the historical narrative, as we actually read it today, was finally codified and written down way later, during the Persian or Hellenistic periods. So we're talking the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE. Just look at artifacts like these silver Gera coins minted in Yehud. They show us the reality of the authors. They were living in a tiny, subjugated province operating under imperial Persian rule. They were looking backward, out of the ashes of exile, desperately needing to construct a unifying national epic to forge a distinct identity. Ultimately, what happened is pretty brilliant. After the northern kingdom fell, southern scribes in Judah basically absorbed the grand fading histories of those powerful northern Amorites. They took the massive walls, the chariots, the international prestige, and they projected it all backward onto their own founding fathers, David and Solomon. So, the United Monarchy narrative isn't a literal stratigraphic blueprint. It's a beautiful architecture of memory, a profound document designed to unify a fractured people. And it leaves us with this powerful realization. Sometimes the stories a culture tells to survive are far more complex and enduring than the dirt alone could ever be. So, what stories are we building our own foundations on today? Think about that. Thanks for learning with me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.